Michael could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Over the past few months, his wife, Emma, had changed in ways he couldn't explain away. At first, he thought it was just the normal ebb and flow of marriage, but it had started to feel different. Emma was distant, almost unreachable. She had become secretive, clinging to her phone in a way that wasn't like her. Messages were left unanswered, dinners turned cold while she disappeared for urgent errands, and he couldn't remember the last time she'd gone out of her way to share her day with him. Even their weekends, once filled with cozy mornings and family outings, now seemed reserved for friends or appointments. When he asked if everything was okay, Emma would smile, say he was overthinking, and quickly change the subject. "Can't a girl just enjoy some time out with her friends?" she'd say with a laugh, but it felt hollow. This Saturday, however, things came to a head. Michael had stepped out to pick up groceries and, on the way home, saw Emma's car parked in the lot across from their neighbor Nick's house. Nick had moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, and they'd become friendly. He was the kind of guy who'd join them for a beer or lend a hand fixing the fence. There was nothing overtly suspicious about their friendship, but then again, why had she never mentioned stopping by his place? Michael's mind spun with possibilities, each worse than the last. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw her car appear a few moments later, her face lit up by a half-fake smile that vanished when she noticed him at the window. "Hey," she said lightly, stepping inside. "I, ran into a friend I hadn't seen in a while." "Really?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though he knew she wasn't telling him the whole truth. "Who?" "Just an old friend," she replied quickly, brushing past him into the kitchen. "I ran a bit late. Sorry I didn't text." Michael's chest tightened. He wanted to press her, to force the truth from her, but he felt like he was gripping sand, the truth slipping through his fingers each time he tried. Emma was always careful to keep things vague, just plausible enough for him to accept without evidence. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every instinct in him screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Was he imagining things, or was she really hiding something from him? And if she was, why? As the days went on, the feeling gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He watched her closely, making mental notes of her behavior. She spent more time on her phone, seemed more guarded about her texts, and smiled less at home. When she was home, it felt like she was somewhere else. A week later, the suspicion boiled over into action. Michael woke up at dawn, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by waiting around. That afternoon, he quietly checked her calendar and saw a lunch with friends marked on Thursday. Another casual day out, just like the others she'd had more frequently these past months. Instead of going into work that day, Michael decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew that this was crossing a line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't, he'd regret it. After she left, he got into his car and followed her at a safe distance. He held his breath when she turned down a familiar road and parked in the same lot across from Nick's house. Just watching her walk up the driveway was enough to make his heart race, anger simmering beneath the surface as he tried to hold himself together. She disappeared inside, and he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling his anger shift into betrayal, a sense of foreboding like he was about to witness something he could never unsee. After what felt like hours, Emma finally left the house, and Michael watched her walk back to her car, her steps quick and calculated, her gaze darting to her phone. The sight of her face, so calm, so composed, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened, made his stomach churn. When she returned home that evening, Michael acted as if nothing had happened. But inside, he felt like a volcano ready to erupt. If she was indeed hiding something, he'd get to the bottom of it. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Michael resolved to find out what was happening between Emma and Nick, even if it meant uncovering a truth he didn't want to believe. Michael's suspicions gnawed at him, deepening with every passing day. The tension between him and Emma was palpable, though she pretended not to notice. He couldn't shake the feeling that her secrecy was more than a phase. It was a choice, a wall she'd built between them to keep him in the dark, and he'd had enough. One night, as Emma slept, Michael found himself staring at her phone on the nightstand, the glow of the screen taunting him. Despite feeling torn between loyalty and his growing distrust, he finally picked it up, his hands trembling as he scrolled through her messages. At first, nothing looked unusual. But then he found a message thread with no contact name, just a series of numbers. He opened it and immediately felt a surge of dread. Each message from this unknown contact was filled with affection, planning, and hints at private meetings. Michael's jaw clenched as he scrolled through weeks of flirtation and secret rendezvous, realizing that his worst fears were true. Then he stumbled upon a conversation from just a few days ago. Unknown, I just want us to be a real family, Emma. Why can't we make it happen? You know how much it means to me. Emma, Nick, please, we've been over this. I can't make promises like that. It's not that simple. Michael's mind raced. Nick, their neighbor. The man he'd shared so many beers with, helped with projects around the house, the man who sat at his dinner table. He felt sick, but as he read on, a new revelation hit him even harder. Nick, look, if we're together, it's just a matter of time, isn't it? Sometimes things happen naturally. Maybe we're just waiting on fate. Emma, Nick, don't get too carried away. Things will happen if they're meant to. Michael felt a surge of anger at her vague, teasing response. She wasn't outright rejecting him. She was playing along just enough to keep Nick invested, to string him along. It was cruel, manipulative, and completely unlike the woman he thought he knew. He read further, noticing a pattern in Nick's messages. Though he never explicitly said it, he seemed to be hinting that he would help fade along if necessary. Michael felt the hairs on his neck prickle. Nick was obsessed, driven by a desire that was pushing him into reckless thoughts. Emma's responses were carefully chosen, vague enough to keep Nick at a distance, yet hopeful enough to keep him interested. She wasn't committing, but she was giving him just enough hope. Michael realized she was manipulating Nick, using his desperation to her advantage. After reading through these texts, Michael set the phone down, his heart racing. The messages left enough ambiguity to be unsettling. Nick was becoming desperate, Emma was toying with him, and Michael was the pawn in a twisted game of betrayal. But the pieces weren't adding up. Why was Nick so fixated on the idea of a child with Emma? And why was she allowing him to entertain that fantasy? Michael closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on him. This wasn't just an affair. It was something darker. There was a desperation in Nick's words, a relentless fixation on making Emma his, and she was allowing him to believe in it. Michael knew he couldn't confront her. Not yet. He had to let this play out, gather more evidence, and uncover the full extent of their lies. As he lay back down, pretending to sleep, his mind raced. He discovered enough to know that their marriage was a lie, that his wife was leading another man into a web of deception. But one thing remained elusive, the question of how far Nick was willing to go. The messages hinted at something disturbing, but Michael knew he needed more. Over the next week, Michael watched his wife with an intensity he never thought himself capable of. Emma's actions seemed calculated. She moved through their home with a sense of normalcy that felt increasingly staged. He noticed little things, like the way she glanced at her phone every few minutes, as if waiting for someone's message, or the way her face lit up in private moments she thought he wasn't watching. She was careful, a master at hiding her game. But he was watching now, scrutinizing her every move, and each new revelation only fueled his resolve. It became clear to Michael that Emma was keeping her lover, Nick, on a string. She was deliberate, answering his messages with just enough affection to maintain his interest, but withholding enough to keep him desperate. She seemed to thrive on Nick's obsession, and her responses reflected a mix of seduction and caution. But what Nick couldn't see, what Michael now fully understood, was that she had no intention of ever fulfilling his dreams of fatherhood. She was managing him, keeping his hopes alive while ensuring she was protected from any lasting consequences. Michael's gut twisted as he read more of their exchanges. He noticed how Nick grew bolder in his messages, hinting at his frustration with her reluctance to have a child. Nick would send texts like, "If you loved me, you'd be willing to take that step. I've wanted this for so long, and I'm getting tired of waiting." But Emma always knew how to reel him back in, keeping the balance just right. "You know how complicated things are. I want this too, but I need to feel secure about everything. It was a well-crafted performance, a delicate balance between giving him enough to stay hopeful and keeping him from asking for too much. As far as Nick was concerned, Emma was his, and it was only a matter of time before they'd be a family. He couldn't see the manipulation, the cold calculation that lay beneath her words. One night, as Emma slept beside him, Michael picked up her phone and discovered something new. A string of messages from earlier that day where Nick had again pressed the issue of having a child together. In his desperation, he had brought up the idea of tampering with the condoms again, the same reckless threat that had haunted Michael since he'd first discovered it. This time, however, Nick didn't stop at words. He openly claimed that he'd already done it, boasting that if they kept seeing each other, it was only a matter of time before she became pregnant. "I've made sure it'll happen," Nick had written. "If we're together, there's no way around it. Sooner or later, you'll have my baby." Emma's reply had been coy, almost playful, as if amused by his persistence. "We'll see. You can't rush these things, Nick. Timing is everything." It was clear to Michael that her response was part of the game, that she'd never let herself get tangled in something she couldn't control. And yet, her flirtation, her clever dodges, only encouraged Nick to believe that she might actually go along with it. She was managing him with precision, dangling the possibility without giving it fully, while he recklessly tried to take matters into his own hands. Michael's anger simmered. The deception was profound. Emma was playing a double game, not just hiding from her husband but actively manipulating her lover. She had even ensured her own protection by secretly taking birth control, a fact Michael had only uncovered by checking her medicine cabinet one night. Each revelation chipped away at his view of her, revealing a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, who thrived in this twisted game of secrecy and manipulation. As he pieced it all together, Michael's initial shock faded, replaced by a cold understanding of her strategy. She was using Nick's desperation to her advantage, dangling the idea of a family, while secretly taking every precaution to prevent it. It wasn't just an affair. It was a controlled betrayal, a cruel game of false promises designed to keep Nick obsessed while safeguarding her own interests. But for Michael, the time for observation was over. He'd learned what he needed to know about her calculated deceit. His anger had cooled, tempered by a growing desire to turn their own game against them. He understood now that confronting her directly would accomplish nothing. Emma was a master at covering her tracks, and a simple confrontation would only lead to more lies, more manipulation. Instead, he began to formulate a plan, a way to expose both of them and make them feel the betrayal and humiliation he had been forced to endure. Michael knew that Emma and Nick both thought they were in control, that they could manage him just as Emma had managed Nick. But they were wrong. He had every piece of evidence he needed to reveal their twisted affair, and he intended to use it when the moment was right. From that night on, Michael's demeanor shifted. He no longer felt helpless or paralyzed by anger. He felt a sense of purpose, a need to reclaim his dignity and make them face the consequences of their actions. Emma might believe she was in control, that her secrets were safe, but Michael was about to prove otherwise. He would keep watching, keep his silence, and prepare for the perfect moment to bring everything to light. Michael's discovery of Nick's messages had left him with a raw, simmering anger. The hints at Nick's desperation to have a child with Emma gnawed at him, and the way she played along made him sick. Every day that passed felt like he was living in a stranger's home, under the shadow of a twisted game that neither of them knew he was onto. Determined to learn more, Michael began watching Emma closely, noting how her demeanor shifted whenever she received a text. She seemed more tense these days, her glances at her phone wary. Michael was sure it was Nick on the other end, sending more of his needy messages. Each day he grew bolder, expressing his frustration with Emma's non-committal responses, and the balance of control between them was beginning to tilt. Late one night, after Emma had gone to bed, Michael decided to search her car. As he carefully opened the glove compartment, his fingers brushed across a small, leather-bound notebook. Frowning, he opened it, surprised to find a series of diary entries scrawled in bold, impatient handwriting. His heart raced. It wasn't Emma's handwriting, it was Nick's. Michael began reading, realizing that he was peering into the mind of the man who was not only his wife's lover, but also her accomplice in deceit. The entries were obsessive, each page revealing more about Nick's growing fixation on the idea of having a child with Emma. The words were filled with yearning and frustration, tracing back weeks, even months, as he detailed every encounter they shared. One entry caught his eye, dated about a month ago. Emma still won't give me a straight answer about having a child together. She's always so careful. She'll kiss me, hold me close, but the moment I talk about us having a real future, she just laughs it off. It's like she's taunting me, but I know what she really wants. She needs a push. Fate needs a little help, and I'll make sure she sees it my way soon enough. Michael's breath caught as he read on, feeling a chill creeping through him. This was more than an affair. This was a man obsessed, a man who couldn't take no for an answer. And Emma, instead of shutting him down, had been letting him believe it was possible, using his desire to control him. The next entry was even more unsettling. I don't care what she says anymore. If she won't let me in, then I'll make it happen. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. She trusts me, and that's her mistake. One night with me, and she won't have a choice anymore. Michael's stomach twisted as he pieced it together. Nick was planning to force the issue, to help fate along, as he'd hinted. It was horrifying, yet Emma seemed oblivious to the danger she'd put herself in. Or worse, she knew and was still playing her twisted game, encouraging him to chase after a child she had no intention of giving him. The entries continued in graphic detail, describing how Nick had grown so desperate that he'd begun tampering with their protection. He recounted how he'd subtly damaged condoms, convincing himself that this would be the night Emma would carry his child. He wrote about how he'd watch her, waiting for the signs, telling himself that each encounter brought him closer to the future he craved. It's only a matter of time now, one entry read. She can't keep hiding from the truth. Soon, she'll see that I'm the only man who can give her what she needs. Michael felt bile rise in his throat. He couldn't believe the extent of Nick's obsession, nor could he believe Emma had put him in this position. She had played him like a puppet, feeding him just enough to keep him compliant, but without any intention of following through. And now Nick had escalated to tampering with protection, a move so reckless and insane that it made Michael's head spin. He snapped the journal shut, his mind racing. The depth of Emma's manipulation, the lengths to which Nick had gone to tie her to him, were staggering. Michael realized that his anger had turned cold, settling into a steely resolve. Emma and Nick thought they were in control, that he was none the wiser, but they had no idea he now held their deepest secrets in his hands. When he returned to bed that night, Michael's course of action had crystallized. Emma would pay for this betrayal, but he wouldn't confront her, not yet. No, he needed to play the part of the oblivious husband. Let them think they were still safe, and then strike when they least expected it. He waited until Emma's breathing evened out, then slipped the diary into a drawer in his office, a grim reminder of the twisted plot he had uncovered. Emma might think she had her lover wrapped around her finger, and Nick might believe he was calling the shots, but Michael knew better now. Their game was over. They just didn't know it yet. In the morning, he returned to his routine, smiling and greeting Emma as if nothing had changed, concealing the knowledge that would ultimately be their undoing. She looked at him with that same detached smile, unaware that he was no longer the man she thought she could control. As he watched her leave for work, Michael felt a strange calm settle over him. He was no longer bound by love or trust. Those bonds had been severed. Now, he was driven by a different purpose: to expose the truth, no matter how dark, and make sure both Emma and Nick faced the consequences of their deceit. Michael continued to watch as Emma's delicate game unraveled. Her affair with Nick, which once seemed like a carefully controlled secret, began to show cracks. She grew restless, her attention scattered, her phone buzzing with messages she would furtively check before quickly locking the screen. Michael could see she was trying to keep everything under wraps, but her discomfort was becoming obvious, even to the children. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Michael noticed her distractedly pushing food around her plate, her eyes unfocused. The tension in the room felt thick. He was waiting, biding his time. But each day only confirmed the depths of her deceit. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Michael decided to delve further. He took her phone once more and read through the most recent text with Nick, curious if there was anything he'd missed. The conversation was heated, charged with a frantic energy. "Nick, you've been avoiding me. Emma, are you having second thoughts?" "Emma, Nick, please. It's complicated. You know it's not that simple." "Nick, it doesn't feel complicated to me. I've done what I can. I've made sure there's no turning back if you just stop running." Michael's stomach turned as he continued reading. Nick was growing increasingly obsessive, and Emma was now struggling to keep up the pretense. She had let him believe that they could have a future, that a child might bring them closer, but now Nick's relentless fixation was beginning to suffocate her. Michael could sense her desperation in the way she replied, her tone cautious yet not entirely rejecting his advances. But there was something different in Emma's responses tonight, a growing sense of unease. "Emma, Nick, I don't know. Things are complicated right now." "Nick, complicated? You know what I want, and you've made it clear you want it too. Don't tell me you're backing out now." "I did what I had to." Emma's reply came slower this time, as if she were carefully choosing her words. "Emma, let's not rush. We have time." Her response seemed to only further incite him. "Nick, no, Emma. I won't be strung along anymore. I deserve to know where we stand." Reading this, Michael sensed that Nick was at his breaking point. Emma's control over him was slipping, and she seemed to be scrambling to hold her ground. But instead of fear, Michael felt a dark satisfaction. She was beginning to lose her grip. He could tell that the reality of Nick's obsession was starting to dawn on her, that maybe she had underestimated his desperation. The next day, Michael noticed Emma was especially quiet, avoiding eye contact and retreating into herself more than usual. He decided to test her again, see how far her mask would slip. After dinner, he pulled her aside. "Emma, you've been distracted," he said, his tone casual but pointed. "Is everything okay?" She looked at him with a flash of something in her eyes, guilt, perhaps, or fear. But she quickly composed herself, offering a soft smile. "Just work stress, you know? It's been a lot lately." "Work stress?" he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "I hope you're not overextending yourself. You know, sometimes it's better to let go of things that don't serve you anymore." Emma swallowed, her face shifting slightly as she processed his words. It was a loaded statement, one that carried a double meaning she couldn't ignore. She forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "You're right. I'll try to handle things better." He nodded, giving her a brief but intense look before leaving her standing in the kitchen. That night, he felt a sense of vindication, knowing she was starting to feel the weight of her actions, knowing she sensed that he might know more than he let on. 2 days later, Michael found a new series of messages from Nick, more agitated than ever. This time, Nick seemed to be spiraling, his messages erratic and demanding. He accused Emma of leading him on, of wasting his time, even hinting that he might expose their affair if she didn't commit to him. "Nick, you said you wanted this. You said we'd be together. Was that a lie?" "Emma, Nick, you need to calm down. I told you, it's not as easy as you think. Nick, if you don't take me seriously, I'll tell him myself. I'm done playing games, Emma." The threat was blatant, and Michael could practically feel Emma's panic seeping through her replies. She attempted to placate him, offering reassurances and promises she had no intention of keeping. But Michael knew it was only a matter of time before Nick's patience snapped completely. That evening, he watched her, waiting for her next move. She was visibly distressed, and he knew she'd soon reach a breaking point. She had no idea how much he'd uncovered, no idea that he'd seen everything, every message, every promise, and every lie. He could barely contain the satisfaction that pulsed within him. Emma thought she had the upper hand, that she could keep Nick and Michael both in check. But Michael's patience was paying off. He had let her game play out, had allowed her to believe she was in control. Now, with Nick's anger building and Emma's anxiety unraveling, he was nearing the moment he'd been waiting for. Emma and Nick had both worn their masks well, but now the cracks were showing, and soon enough, everything would come crashing down. The night of the dinner party had arrived, and Michael felt a cold resolve settle over him as he set everything into motion. Emma had accepted the invitation with hesitation, her nerves evident as she glanced at Nick's name on the guest list. She masked her worry well, but Michael saw through it. He knew she was terrified of any confrontation between her husband and her lover. But that was precisely the point. The house was full of friends and neighbors by early evening. Everyone gathered for what they thought was a casual get-together. Nick arrived with an uncomfortable smile, and Michael welcomed him warmly, playing the part of a gracious host. Emma shot Nick a tense look from across the room, clearly hoping he'd keep his distance. Yet as the evening wore on, Nick's eyes lingered on Emma, unable to hide his attachment. After dinner, Michael saw his opportunity. He stood up, glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I have a little toast I'd like to make to Emma, my wonderful wife." Emma froze, her smile wavering as she glanced around the room. She shot a worried look at Nick, who looked equally uneasy. "Emma," Michael continued, holding her gaze, "you've been my partner for almost a decade. I've trusted you, shared everything with you, and always believed that our marriage was built on mutual respect and honesty." The guests quieted, sensing the tension. Emma looked down, her cheeks flushed, her hands clasped tightly. But Michael continued, his voice hardening. "Sometimes, even in the closest relationships, trust can be broken. And when that happens, it's only fair for everyone involved to know the truth." With that, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Nick's leather-bound journal, holding it up for everyone to see. Emma's face went pale, her eyes widening in horror. "I found something recently," he said, his tone icy. "Something that revealed more than I ever wanted to know about my wife and our neighbor." He opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud one of Nick's chilling entries. "Emma won't give me a straight answer about having a child together. But if she won't make it happen, I will. I've done what I had to, made sure our time together will bear results." A shocked murmur spread through the room, guests exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. Michael looked up, holding Emma's gaze. Her face was a mask of terror, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for something to say. Nick, on the other hand, looked stricken, his eyes wide, his body tense. But Michael wasn't done. He flipped through a few more pages, choosing another incriminating passage. "I don't care what she says. I'm taking control. If it means tampering with things to make sure, then so be it. Fate needs a push." The room fell silent. Nick's face was drained of color, his hands clenched at his sides. Emma looked at him, her expression somewhere between shock and panic, clearly struggling to comprehend the depth of Nick's obsession and recklessness. "Michael," she stammered, her voice barely audible. It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think, Emma," he replied, his voice razor-sharp. "You played him, letting him believe you'd build a life together. You manipulated him, and he manipulated you right back. But the difference is, you both underestimated me." He walked over to Nick, handing him the journal. "Go ahead, Nick. Take a look at your own words. You wanted a child with her so badly that you resorted to sabotaging protection? Did you think that was love?" Nick stood motionless, gripping the journal, his face a mixture of guilt and fury. The rest of the guests were frozen, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. Some whispered in shock, others looked at Emma with thinly veiled disgust. Finally, Michael turned to the room. "I invited you all here to witness the truth, to show the lies that have festered in my own home, right under my nose. And now, thanks to Nick's journal, I have everything I need." With that, he faced Emma one last time. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her face pale as a ghost, realizing the finality of his words. "This marriage is over, Emma. I'll be filing for divorce, and trust me, I'll be using every word in that journal to make sure you walk away with nothing." Emma reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch his arm, but he stepped back, a look of pure resolve in his eyes. "Don't," he said coldly. "This is the life you chose, the lies you built. Now you get to live with them." Nick, finally breaking his silence, tried to interject. "Michael, I didn't mean." Michael cut him off with a cold glare. "You're no better, Nick. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew she was married, and you chose to play along, tampering with things to get what you wanted. You're just as guilty, and I want you out of my life." Nick, defeated and humiliated, nodded and quietly walked out, leaving Emma standing alone among their friends and neighbors, utterly exposed. She could barely meet anyone's gaze as whispers filled the room, the weight of judgment settling on her. One by one, the guests began to leave, murmuring apologies or avoiding her entirely. When the last person had gone, Emma stood alone in the empty, silent house, her entire world crumbling around her. As Michael walked out the door, he felt a sense of liberation, knowing he'd laid bare their secrets and shattered their illusions. And for the first time in months, he felt free, ready to leave the past behind and start anew, finally rid of the lies that had once controlled his life. Michael closed the door behind the last guest, the echo of the evening's chaos settling into an eerie silence. Emma sat alone on the couch, her shoulders slumped, face still wet with tears, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. She looked up at him, as if hoping for one final plea, some chance to make things right. But Michael felt nothing but a quiet resolve. "I meant what I said. Pack your things. I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week." Emma's face fell, the reality of his words landing with a final, crushing weight. She took a shuddering breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Michael, please. I made a mistake, but I love you. I was never going to leave you." Michael's expression didn't change. He was done with the lies, done with the excuses. "Love doesn't do what you did, Emma. You kept it going, you manipulated both of us, and when things got out of control, you still didn't stop. Whatever love you had for me, it wasn't enough to make you honest." Emma closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what came over me. I was just—" But he cut her off. "I don't want to hear it anymore. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." With that, Michael turned and left her alone in the room, feeling the finality of his decision wash over him. He walked upstairs, feeling a strange sense of peace settle into his chest. After everything he had been through, after the lies and betrayal, he was finally free of it all. He would start fresh, rebuild his life without the shadows of Emma's deceit hanging over him. But as he opened his bedroom door, his eyes fell on the drawer beside his bed, the one where Emma had once kept her old phone, the device she'd used before upgrading a few months back. A new thought crept into his mind, something he hadn't considered before. Michael quietly opened the drawer and retrieved the phone. It powered on immediately, her old passcode still working. Curiosity nudged him to search through the texts and messages. As he scrolled through Emma's old conversations, his heart began to race. There were messages dating back nearly a year, and several were with a contact labeled N. But as he opened the conversation, he realized these weren't from Nick. They were from someone else, a man named Nathan, who'd apparently also been seeing her, well before Nick came into the picture. His pulse quickened as he scrolled through the messages, realizing the depth of her deception. Nathan had been another lover, one she'd ended things with just before she began her affair with Nick. She'd been playing this game far longer than he'd thought, manipulating yet another man into believing they had a future together. In the texts, Nathan seemed as desperate as Nick had been, begging her for honesty, pleading with her to leave Michael so they could start a life together. Michael's chest tightened as he read through the exchanges. Nathan had also wanted children with her, had also been manipulated into believing Emma wanted a family with him. The pattern was unmistakable. Emma had spent years honing her ability to manipulate, to deceive, to play with men's emotions like pieces in her own private game. But as Michael reached the final messages, he noticed something even more alarming. The messages grew dark, almost threatening, as Nathan's frustration boiled over. He could sense her lies and was beginning to demand answers. His last message was chilling. "Nathan, if you don't tell him, I will. You don't get to ruin lives without consequences." The date on that message was from nearly a year ago, the exact same time when Nick had started coming around. Michael's heart sank as he pieced together the implication. Emma hadn't just moved on from Nathan to Nick. She'd likely used Nick to rid herself of Nathan's threats, finding someone more easily manipulated to fill his place. The cold realization struck him like a blow. She had replaced one lover with another whenever things grew complicated, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted wife. She'd kept each man under control, using their desires and weaknesses as leverage until she didn't need them anymore. He turned off the phone, feeling a surge of disgust and resolve. This wasn't about love, about a marriage that had soured. Emma had been playing games with people's lives for years. She had betrayed, deceived, and manipulated without remorse, caring only for the power and attention that her lies afforded her. Michael walked downstairs, his face set in a grim determination. Emma looked up as he entered, fresh confusion in her eyes. "I found your old phone, Emma," he said, his voice low and controlled. Her face went pale, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes. "Michael, But he didn't let her finish. "You weren't just cheating with Nick. There was Nathan, too, wasn't there? And who knows how many others before him. You never cared about us, did you? You only cared about feeding your own ego, about controlling everyone around you." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked away, her expression hollow, defeated. Michael took a deep breath, feeling a final wave of relief. He was truly free from her web of lies. "I'll be gone by morning," he said. "You can keep the house, the facade you built here. But you'll have to live with yourself now, alone, with nothing but the mess you created." Without another word, he turned and left, the weight of betrayal lifting from his shoulders as he walked out into the night. For the first time, he felt truly liberated, knowing he'd escaped the twisted game Emma had spent years crafting. As he drove away, Michael felt a strange, cold peace settle over him. The final twist had been hers, but he had the last word.